Our final witness is Mark Yarnell, advocate of Refugees International. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much for having me. And I know you have to attend to your legislative duties,
That's okay,
so I'll be fairly
This
brief.
is actually more important than the things we're voting on the floor, so, yeah.
Well, first, thank you very much for holding the hearing and for drawing attention to this ongoing critical issue. Both to you and your staff for holding this hearing, and Representative Edwards for being here as well. Just for those who don't know, Refugees International is a independent humanitarian advocacy group focused on refugees, IDPs, and statelessness. I also have to begin by expressing sadness at the tragic loss of Representative Payne. He's a true champion for Africa, constantly displayed leadership, used his authority to address these kinds of issues, and certainly as we navigate the challenges of the current crisis, his passion and leadership will be sorely missed. I'm just returned a couple weeks ago from a research trip to Kenya and Ethiopia, so I'll just hit on a few key observations and then answer any questions you might have. Just to echo what my fellow panelists expressed, the situation in Somalia remains absolutely critical and fragile. There's been food security gains, but they could change depending on the impact of the next rains. And also there's conflict on multiple fronts. While last year we saw displacement as a result of famine and drought, in January and February in this year we're seeing major displacement as a result of conflict. In January and February alone, there were 63,000 Somalis internally displaced as a result of insecurity. And since we don't expect conditions conducive to large-scale return of Somalis to their homes anytime soon, I think significant and sustained attention on refugee populations is necessary. So I'll just make a few quick comments about Kenya, which is home to some 520,000 Somali refugees, and to discuss the challenges in Dadaab. It's been rocked by a series of security incidents, which has made access to aid far more challenging. But the UNHCR and NGOs are working to find creative ways to lessen the international staff footprint, hand over some responsibilities to refugees, and are working through what I think are some creative solutions. But what is exacerbating the challenges, and what has been mentioned, is the fact that Kenya still hasn't resumed registration of new refugees. Kenya deserves serious credit for hosting so many refugees for so many years, but the lack of registration is unacceptable. And while there have been comments that they intend to resume soon, I really want to impress upon the Congress and U.S. government to really call on Kenya to begin registration immediately. Without registration, new refugees are not entitled to services from the UN Refugee Agency, such as food and shelter. There's no system for identifying who the most vulnerable are as they arrive, such as unaccompanied children, women who have been sexually assaulted. And third, there's no security screening to identify those who might pose a danger to the camp's residents, aid workers, and police. So this is something that really must be solved immediately and can't wait any further. Of additional concern, there's been periodic statements by Kenyan officials that they intend to return Somalis to Somalia in areas that they claim to have cleared militarily. We must stress any return by Somalis to Somalia must be voluntary, safe, and dignified. There is no refugee right more fundamental than that of voluntary return. So these comments are concerning and must continue to press upon the Kenyan government to abide by its commitments of international law. But what I think is more likely than a kind of overt movement of Somalis from Kenya up into Somalia under the eye of the international community is that conditions within Dadaab are being made so harsh that refugees feel that they have no choice but to return. And this is happening more sort of quietly and without attention, but has the same impact of refugees who are forced to return to conditions that aren't safe. One issue that is contributing to this is the harassment by Kenyan police of refugees, including mass arbitrary arrests, sexual assault, physical abuse. According to one Kenyan refugee we met, we suffer two times. We suffer harassment by al-Shabaab in Somalia, and then we suffer again in Kenya because people think we're al-Shabaab. Now, we must rely on the Kenyan police because they're the ones that are responsible for securing the camp, for securing the aid workers, for securing the refugees themselves. But this kind of behavior is absolutely unacceptable, and I think the U.S. government must ensure that Kenya has the proper resources and capacities to train its police in prevention of abuse, in protection of refugees, and ensure that there's investigations and due process when abuses occur. Now, just a couple of points on Ethiopia, which is also hosting a very high number of refugees. I'll respectfully disagree with fellow panelists who indicated that there weren't any challenges regarding restriction of space for humanitarian actors. Certainly at the beginning of the crisis, in the summer, moving into the fall, Ethiopia was quite strong in terms of keeping its border open, registering new refugees, opening space for new actors who had high capacity to deal with the onset of the crisis. Morbidity and mortality was brought under control. But as was mentioned, malnutrition is still very high. I mean, the emergency threshold for global acute malnutrition is 15%, and we're seeing rates of upwards of 40 and 50% in some of the camps, alarmingly high. And within this context, we are seeing Ethiopia beginning to restrict access by aid workers, an effort to reclaim implementing authority when we don't think they may have the capacity to effectively address the needs. It might be biased, but my colleague and I were denied access when we tried to visit the camps. I know some high-level donor representatives that weren't allowed to go. And I guess the concern is that as Ethiopia restricts the space, there'll be less information coming in and out of the camps. And it's more than kind of bickering in terms of NGOs competing for each other over control. We are seeing more challenges in terms of understanding what's actually happening on the ground. And I think that the fact that the U.S. is such a close ally with Ethiopia, tremendous bilateral donor, there must be some diplomatic leverage to ensure that there's oversight. The U.S. funds a large portion of UNHCR's budget, which itself directly funds virtually the entire budget of Ethiopia's refugee agency. So to sort of, yes, there might be a close relationship between the U.S. and the Ethiopian government, but there must be some level of oversight. So I'll end there because I know there's more to get to. But just to conclude, the challenges are obviously extremely complex. But where we do have control and where we do have access, it's our responsibility to ensure that the needs and protection of the most vulnerable are being met. Thanks very much.
Do you have any questions? Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for being here, and I think the kind of the perspective from kind of the refugee vantage point is very, very important as we talk about this crisis, because it is a very, very serious issue. You mentioned the challenges with the Kenyan police and not registering refugees. That's obviously a great concern. Let me go to the issue of Somalia. What can the United States and the international community do better to protect and assist internally displaced people within Somalia?
I think the main thing is that given the tremendous numbers of displaced within Somalia, hundreds of thousands displaced in Mogadishu, as you mentioned. Right. My colleagues were in Mogadishu in October and witnessed, while there was some positive delivery of aid, a lot of the camp management is run by the transitional federal government, which often has its allied militias who are in control, sort of the gatekeepers of the camps, and they've been involved in sort of systematic abuse of refugees and corruption and avoiding the delivery of services. And since the TFG is a government that the U.S. and the international community is supporting and is boosting, to allow this kind of activity to happen without oversight, without it being aware, sort of in the public eye, is quite concerning. And I think so, sort of working more closely with the TFG on ensuring that those who are displaced in areas that at least it does control can be a positive step. And then obviously there's areas where there's very pro-access in south central Somalia. And those are challenges that many of us are working to try and figure out how best to address. I mean, certainly it's discussed often the OFAC restrictions don't help. And even if there isn't access now, when access becomes open, we're concerned that the continuing restrictions regarding OFAC may inhibit groups from moving into where they are able to now operate.
You just one final thing. You mentioned that, going back to Kenya, you mentioned that the Kenya government deserves credit because they've had to accept a lot of refugees over the years, but nonetheless, I mean, you highlight some important problems. One, for those who are in the camps, what services are they not being provided? And just for the record, again, if you're not registered, what does that mean to people who enter the area?
Right. So if you're not registered, you essentially do not have eligibility to receive refugee benefits that are provided by the UN Refugee Agency, and so food, shelter, non-food items, health screening, health care. I think the agencies that are there and are doing their best to try and reach those populations, but there are certainly people who are being missed, and it's tragic given the circumstances.
I appreciate that. I just wanted to have that for the record.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And just a couple of questions in terms of Kenya. What is the United States doing, or the international community doing, in terms of police training? Do we have an effective police training mechanism for?
As far as I know, there is, or it has been in the past, police training. Some of it done through the UN Refugee Agency on protection. The challenge is that often once police are trained, there's no guarantee that they're actually going to go to the camps. And there hasn't been, I think, strong follow-through on whether the training's been effective. And I think given the acuteness or the severity of what's going on in Dadaab and how much we must rely on Kenya and police for security, that there must be kind of closer oversight of these training programs. Because they have been happening, but obviously they haven't been too effective given what we're seeing on the ground.
And with respect to both Kenya and Somalia, does this, with the sort of gatekeeping that you described, is 100% of the assistance getting through?
Oh, I wouldn't say 100%. No, that's. I mean, in a complex crisis such as this, it's going to be impossible to. Is
a substantial amount of the assistance getting through? I'm just trying to figure out. Obviously, there's a more organized mechanism, particularly with respect to Somalia, about the control of the camps. And I'm just trying to figure out what that means with respect to the assistance that does get through.
I think it depends. I think my colleagues who were in Mogadishu saw some camps that were very well run, were receiving strong amounts of aid. Particularly those run by Turkish agencies, but then right next door saw camps that were in devastating conditions, and I think that's a concern, because when you have some aid that's very strong and some that's very poor, it can create competition between the groups. So it's really a diverse level of assistance that's reaching through, and that in itself is problematic. And so obviously, I mean, the need for kind of more comprehensive coordination is essential.
And again, to this question, I think I understand what leverage points there might be with respect to Kenya. That's a bit of a different circumstance. Yeah. I'm just trying to figure, though, what, if any, leverage points we have with Somalia.
With Somalia? I mean, the transitional federal government certainly is, controls a very small area of Somalia, essentially just Mogadishu. But that is an area where there is a very large number of internally displaced people. And since we are supporting that government, I think we do have the opportunity to try and push them on the way that they're behaving regarding IDPs. And even if it doesn't, it's still challenges for Puntland and South Central. They do control parts of Mogadishu, and that's where you need to have a stronger oversight and pressure.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Appreciate your work, and thank you to Refugees International for all the work that it does.
Well, thanks.
We're grateful for you to be here on this. This is a very important hearing, and this will not be the last hearing on this issue, I can assure you. But I think it is important that we've raised some awareness today, and we're going to continue to do so. Thank you.
Thanks again. Thanks so much.